All right. Now, I hope you could keep the enthusiasm intact for the final panel session of the summit. The last session of the day is on trending topic that has gained worldwide attention this past few weeks, climate and sustainability. The panel will be discussing on delivering climate action from policy to grassroots for people, planet, and prosperity. For this, I'm pleased to inform that the session will be moderated by Ms. Nisa Aris, a 2018-2019 Chivener, and Ms. Lee Jin Chin from batch 2015-2016. Hi, Nisa and Lee Jin. Nisa is currently serving as a community investment manager in Yayasan Bursa Malaysia. She is also a mental health practitioner and a trainer under the Red Cross and Red Crescent movement. She is also our camp treasurer, and despite all this, juggling through all this, she's also pursuing a second master's in education for professional counseling in University of Malaya. Whereas Lee Jin is a senior managing partner at ACMF Circular Economy, a passionate problem solver at heart who cares deeply for the environment. Lee Jin has 10 years experience of research consulting, mainly for the Malaysian government and multilateral agencies like the United Nations Development Programme. So Nisa and Lee Jin, the screen is yours.
Thank you so much, Shamila, for the introduction. And thank you so much for everyone for still tuning in with us for the final, but the most important panel for today's CAM Summit. Why is it so? Well, COP26 Summit just recently concluded, where the focus was on getting the world's attention on the urgent need to tackle climate change. It delivered on several key outcomes related to limiting global temperature rise, climate finance, and carbon markets. Well, there's a few critical outcomes that were discussed. First, the world looked to government to ramp up their national commitment in order to maintain global temperatures to no more than 1.5 degree rise. Well, we heard of this 1.5. It's a target set by Paris Agreement intended to limit some of the worst impacts of climate change. Second, wealthy countries were expected to deliver on the 100 billion annual contribution committed to at the COP15 summit in Copenhagen. This finance was intended to help developing countries like us to address climate change mitigation as well as to provide resources for adaptation. Third, the progress was anticipated on key elements of the Paris Agreement, such as Article 6, crafted to provide the foundation for a credible and global carbon market to help deliver on emission commitments. Well, we are not here to discuss all about the outcomes of COP26. Well, we need a whole day to discuss on that at least, but we are here to talk about what does it mean by delivering climate action from policy to grassroots in Malaysian context for the people, planet, and prosperity. Without further ado, I'd like to invite my co-moderator, Lee Jin, to introduce our esteemed panelists.
Thanks, Nisa, for setting the scene. Very good morning, actually, from the UK for me, and good afternoon to you all. I'm very happy to be joined today with three panelists to get into this discussion. So please let me welcome Ms. Karen Nisa Zabidi. Karen leads the UK International Climate Fund, ICF, in Malaysia via the UK Partnerships for Accelerated Climate Transitions, which we call short form UK PACT program. She has over 15 years of experience in corporate responsibility, sustainability reporting and standards, ESG strategy and integration, as well as capacity building for the mitigation and adaptation of climate change, covering the private, public and third sector. She's a Chivener from 2016-2017, studied in LSE in Environment and Development. Welcome, Karen. Next on, I'd like to introduce Mr. Q Jayal. He's the partner of Q & Co. and co-deputy chair, Bar Council Environment and Climate Change Committee. Jaya was called to the Malaysian Bar in 2004, and he serves as the co-deputy chair of the Bar Council Environment and Climate Change Committee. He's also a secretariat member of the All-Party Parliamentary Group in Malaysia on Sustainable Development Goals, which you may know from the short form APPGM SDG, which is actually quite a long form. Anyway, JL advises the organizations that work on sustainable development, youth participation, and environmental justice. He's a Chiefner from 2013 and 2014 batch, studied in SOAS in environmental law. Warm welcome to you, JL. Lastly, I'd like to invite Ms. Lavanya Rama-Ir. She is currently the head of policy and climate change for WWF Malaysia and represents the CSO SDG Alliance and several SDG task force. Her other experience includes working with the Malaysian government and the UNDP on preparing Malaysia's climate change report, working at the United Nations in Geneva on post-conflict issues, and practicing law in Malaysia. Lavanya studied at University of Leeds in sustainability and climate change. Hello, Lavanya, good to see you here today. So a very warm welcome to all of you, and thank you for joining us today. Let's get straight into the discussion. Now, I realize that we do have this sort of our topic of sustainability and climate change is under this bigger umbrella of the CAM Summit's theme, which is towards meaningful and equitable post-pandemic recovery. So the first question I'd like to throw out to our panelists here is, why should the post-pandemic recovery actually take climate change into consideration? Maybe we can start off with Kyron, and then followed by Lavanya and Jaya.
Hi, thanks, Legion, and hi everyone for joining in today. It's really good to see everybody. That's a really good question to start off with, and I think when COVID first hit, we all had this very sense of not just dread, but also hope, because it was an incredible opportunity for us to see how the world will work together to respond to something as serious that would affect an entire global population. And I think a lot of us in the sustainability space saw this as an opportunity to review the trajectory of development that we were on and see how we could also harness the same kind of energy that we would respond to a post-pandemic crisis, to something very similar to the sustainability or climate change crisis. So the reason why I think it really is an opportunity more than anything else, it was a test to see how our governance structures operated, how we worked together, and how we collaborated across different countries to address a very global problem. Happy for someone else to take that next.
Jaya, maybe I can call on you next then.
Hi everyone. Thanks for the invitation, and it's wonderful to be here among these fellow panelists and all of you. I think that the pandemic has given us 2 years to really realize how the environmental protection of environmental rights and conservation of environmental our natural environment and our social needs and our social economic needs are really intertwined. And so I think when we talk about building back the economy, we zoom that out, the economy belongs in society, and we are talking about building back the society that's just been ravaged by this a challenging pandemic. I think what's been happening is the world has been dealing with a very challenging ecological challenge all along, and I think how we've gone about with responding to COVID, there are a lot of lessons that we should take on board in terms of reassessing how are we going to tackle this. You know, climate change is not just a scientific problem; it's a responsibility problem. It's a behavioral problem, and just like the disease, you know, no one is safe until everyone is safe. So yeah, maybe Lavanya next.
Yeah, thank you. And thank you so much for the invitation. I'm also a Shivana 2011-2012, and great to be here with all of you. I see some familiar faces in the audience, and of course, all the fellow panelists are very good friends, and Legion and Nisa as well. Great to see you again. So let me just add to that, maybe throwing in some science into this as well. So, you know, the recent IPCC report and has said that we have about 8 years, really, 8 years to meet the 1.5 degree world that Nisa mentioned earlier. So it's not much time. It's not like we can, do the recovery first and then look at climate action later. It has to happen in tandem. It really has to happen in tandem, because if not, we are losing the last opportunity. I mean, it's already been said that this is the red alert. The red alert has been sent out. And if we don't act, we are actually committing ourselves to a life on a planet which, is probably unknown, unheard of, with all kinds of problems, not just one pandemic, which already has crippled us, by the way, but a whole host of things, from health implications to food security issues to loss of homes, loss of infrastructure, so your loss of communication towers and all that has enabled us to use MySejahtera to get around places. All that, are potentially at risk all together at the same time with the, with the climate crisis. So I don't mean to start off on a very scary note, but I think we have to bear this in mind, right? And so we need to actually embed into our actions immediately actions that not only serve what we, the immediate needs, to help the vulnerable, to help those who have been very hard hit by this pandemic. And the reasons for that are also, something that we need to explore, the root cause of why some people were more, vulnerable than others. And we can take, touch on that later. But we also, at the same time, need to ensure that what we are doing is aligned to that 1.5 degree world. So we need to take actions that that also consider the need for climate mitigation and adaptation. And these actions need to be not only hard actions in terms of the decisions that we take on what type of infrastructure we want to build, what type of consumption, what type of production we undertake, how we measure progress, but also the soft skills, our own value systems, right? Our own purpose, and being impact driven. So I think these combination of things have to come together as part of the recovery package, because we are now at the great reset, the time of great reset, actually.
Yeah, sorry.
I just wanted to say thanks for raising that up. So, yep, Lisa.
Yeah, it's good that Lavanya, you mentioned about vulnerable people, right? So in Malaysia itself, which group will be most affected? When you say vulnerable people, who are they actually? And what are the plans in place to reduce this impact on them? Because I work in humanitarian and I see these people every day. They are the most impacted people, but is there any plan? And what does it mean by climate justice actually?
Okay. You want me to take that first?
Yeah,
Okay.
yeah, and then you can pass on. Thanks.
Okay. Well, I'll just touch on the first part and then go into a bit more depth on the second one on climate justice. Who are the most vulnerable? I would throw this back. I won't say it's your regular, maybe the people who are the poorest or the people who live in our interiors, because I think what COVID has shown is people who have a social security framework or background, and who have cohesiveness in their societal interactions, have survived this crisis better. And those in the interiors, for example, in the the Orang Asli or whatever, in the interiors have continued to survive with their regular activities. They've not been so impacted as maybe others in the city. So to me, it's not really a matter of pure monetary well-being, if you'd like, your poverty level, but more the circumstances you find yourself in and whether you have that social network to support you through a time of crisis, right? We saw with COVID also, it wasn't, the economy came to a standstill, right? It was crippled, but it was people who came out to support others. it was that social, that values that really kept people going and, people being helped. You recall that, the original response was from civil society and everyone just coming together and going out and helping their fellow human beings, right? So to me, so the most vulnerable are those who actually don't have that social support structure, who have maybe not even had time to invest in that social support structure. I listened to the last part of the last panel. Investing in your family, investing in your friends is super important, right? Let's not forget that. So I think the most vulnerable would be those people who are bereft of those kind of support mechanisms. Now, in terms of climate justice, I would say, let me just give you, again, going back to a bit of science, sorry, we can talk about it more. But science tells us, as I mentioned, we have a carbon budget and we have only, thanks Tian Yan, 8 years to keep within that carbon budget of 1.5 degrees, right? At the rate we are going, meaning if we continue to emit emissions at the current rate, we only have 8 years more of that budget, right? And what does that budget mean? It means there has been a pie, let's say, right? A pie that everybody is able to access for their developmental rights, to progress, right? But in this process, some countries have grabbed it, have eaten a lot, okay? Maybe they didn't realize they were doing it in the past. I'm not saying there's any blame attached to this in the past. Historically, from the time of industrialization, that was in the 1800s, we had industrialization happening, and the pie, I'm equating it to the carbon budget, the atmospheric space that we have, which absorbs the emissions that we generate, right, in progressing. So some of these countries grab that very rapidly, and other countries didn't, right? So now we have come to a point where there's very little of that pie left, tiny sliver of that pie left. How do you divide that? I mean, there's still a lot of countries that are nowhere close to the, so-called standard of living that some of the rich countries have. So I'm not saying that we need to emulate the way of living of the rich countries. I think there's a lot to be desired there, and we can discuss that later, and especially with the, in the context of psychology and all, which Lisa will help us with, I think. But there is still a minimum standard of living that a lot of communities and societies haven't met yet. And in order to meet that, they need to be able to access part of that remaining carbon budget. So climate justice is about enabling them to access that. But in addition to that, there is also a need to compensate. In COP26, which I had the good fortune of actually attending in person, part of the civil society movements were talking about the need for compensation for loss and damage to be the third pillar of the whole climate architecture. We have climate mitigation, which is to reduce emissions. Moving forward, we have climate adaptation, which is to adapt so that we are able to withstand the impacts of climate change that we are already going to face regardless of what we do. And then we have loss and damage, which is to actually compensate to those who are still going to be impacted, regardless of how much mitigation, regardless of how much adaptation you do, right? And there was one person who very powerfully said that 45 trillion had been taken away from India, right, by the colonial masters. So, I mean, you can see the kind of, balancing act that needs to happen now, right? It's a matter of morality, and I just like to make one more point. As Jayal said, if we are all not safe together, then we are all sunk, right? I didn't quote Jayal properly, but yeah.
Thank you, Lavanya. maybe we'll interject there and then have Jaya have a piece to say.
Sorry, that I said that if if everyone is not safe, then we are not safe either, right? So that was that. I
No one is
want
safe,
to add
yeah.
to what Lavanya said about. So Lavanya has brought that the international perspective, and in the domestic side, looking at our own country, so at the national, state, and then local area, local community, local government. From that to the question should really be asked. Yes, which group would be most affected, and I think that's the question, and that should be data driven, should be impact driven, and we have severe gaps right now the way our systems and frameworks are built, in the sense of absorbing data from the ground and then analyzing the data and sharing it across the ministries and agencies for understanding it at a high definition. So that is really important. We need to build that. So we need to build systems to help us identify who's going to be hardest hit, rather than just go with our conventional wisdom of like, yeah, we know who, it's always there. And then we just reach for the same charismatic and marginalized communities and just assume that those are the ones, because of the intersectionality of these issues, right? There's the gender side, there's the ethnic differences, there's the cultural background, there's the geographic, the urban, non-urban, but much more than that. So, and when they intersect, then they have very different outcomes and impacts that manifest. So what we need to do, a smart way to go about is that we need to build systems in which we can capture from the ground. So capture what's going on the ground. And so one is to have really open systems. And then two is we need to build partnerships with the civil society organizations that Lavanya has talked about, because they are on the ground, and these are, they are much more in touch on the grassroots level. And that obviously directly imbues your work with the legitimacy of accuracy, right? And also there is the bottom up and then the top down, where you co-create solutions, right? So we talk about, if we are talking about mitigation, we're talking about compensation for, and talk about loss and damage. How do you build resilience? You need to co-create these solutions. That's the best way to go about it, rather than design them from Putrajaya and then apply them with the same swipe, whether it's in Kelantan communities or someone in Sungai Petani or someone in Tanjung Piai. I think that's very 70s. Yeah. So if we're not going to be caught dead wearing bell bottoms or, then I think we need to really go about this response in this way, in an open source kind of collaborative way, in a hyper collaborative way. Yeah. So that's my intervention here. Thanks.
Yeah, I'd like to just plug in there, because I hear from Lavanya and Jayal that there's a lot of things that we would need to do, but at the same time, something that Karen mentioned earlier on about this atmosphere of hope. I think hope is something that is very important in order for people to even get into the mode of co-creating, of even getting in the mode of taking action, and despite all odds, care for others as well. So maybe we can touch a little bit from that perspective. Karen, if you would like to elaborate further, because I do feel that there's a big majority of us that do sense a paralysis, because we can't imagine how we would solve such a big problem like climate crisis. And through your experiences, I'm sure you've met a number of situations like that. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, thanks, Lee Jin, and thanks, Lavanya and Jaya. I think just to add on that, I'd like to provide a perspective of intergenerational justice. And I think this really fits in really nicely with Lee Jin's point about hope. And just briefly on that, and if we think about who's hardest hit, we can talk about the people today, but also we need to talk about the people who's going to be facing climate change and the worst impacts of that tomorrow. And one of the campaigns that I remember when I was a youth campaigner 10 years ago working on intergenerational justice was, how old will I be in 2050? And I'll be 64, so I'll be alive when the worst hits of climate change we'll see the first impacts of that, or we're seeing that today. But I think more interestingly, I think the narrative was very much about access to decision making that will impact my life in the future. And I remember in my early 20s, and we were lobbying policymakers and saying, you know, the decisions you're making today will impact me in the future, but you'll be dead and buried by the time I have to live with those decisions. And that's the reality of how our kids, and I think at the time, this was before like a post-COVID crisis. And I look at my kids today, I've got a 7 and 9-year-old, and they've been out of school for the last 2 years because of the pandemic. And I ask myself, are we educating them? Are we equipping them with the kind of knowledge and the skill sets they need to be able to respond to that? So it's to respond to a crisis like that. It isn't just about, you know, policy decision making, but also down to the micro level. What kind of skills are going to be relevant for our children today to be able to respond to the climate crisis? You know, things like leadership, things like conflict resolution, things like decision making, collaboration. All that isn't being taught in our schools today. And so that type of resilience and that type of ability to, you know, grow your own food or even generate your own electricity, those are the kind of things that, you know, we would probably need to see a little bit more come into our schools, and that's not happening. So in terms of intergenerational justice, that's really, really a big part of a community that will be quite hit quite badly. But I think because of the nature of children as well, there is this sense of, look, you know what? A lot of the jobs that we're going to be working on in the future don't exist today. A climate change consultant, for instance, 10 years ago, you would never hear of that. Some of the work I do today as a program manager, and you know, I'm investing in a number of different climate programs here in Malaysia, and some of this work is really, you know, things like mapping above ground biomass, for instance, so that we can start looking at carbon markets and trading that internationally or domestically. Things like, you know, creating a new asset class that isn't being recognized even by the Securities Commission and the central bank, which is carbon. Things like payment ecosystems, payment for ecosystem services, all of these concepts, those are the things that I think young people are really, with their creativity and their hope and this thinking that, you know, we can't rely on an older generation that caused the problem to create that solution. So I think that's the message that we need to be telling a lot of young children, that, you know, those solutions are yet to be created. Those jobs, you know, like maybe vertical farming. A vertical farmer, I'm not sure that exists today, or things like, you know, nature-based solutions, or an asset manager of a company that invests in different types of decarbonization strategies, you know. So there are all these, you know, new jobs that have yet to exist. A carbon broker, but I think, you know, those are the real. I think we have to ask ourselves whether or not our children have that capacity to be creative and be responsive, to sort of really look into solutioning and building new solutions for climate change. And I think very easily that's, I think the answer is yes, there is that hope. Yes, our children are creative. Yes, we can sandbox these ideas as long as we recognize that they do have a voice. And you know, that there are spaces that we would probably need to create for them, and I think that's the opportunity that people like us who are in that space, who can mobilize and create those opportunities for young people today.
Thank you very much for that. And I'm glad we talked about this topic, because even pairing it with where Nisa comes from in terms of how people are linked to the environment and their mental health well-being and the psychology that needs to go into it, that's something I think would be very interesting to delve deeper further. I don't know if Nisa, you would like to add to that before we move on to the next question.
Yeah, I see that Jaya want to say something, but before that, often when we talk about sustainability and climate change, we focus on the hard stuff, right? Like hard stuff where you want to, you know, put in all this structure, but people forget that the soft part, like Karen mentioned about resilience, building resilience, leadership, conflict resolution. But what about how do you, you know, because sustainability ultimately climate change ultimately will impact, diseases in the future, resources. It will reduce in the future. It will be much more competitive. Some of the jobs you mentioned will not be there in the future. So it will add more stress, more than what we have today. 50% of people already became more stressed than last year. So it's going to go crazier and crazier. So we have to tie sustainability efforts to mental health, where we prepare our youth that, hey, this is going to happen in the future. So you got to start putting on, like, learning about psychology behind it. You have to start with your behavioral changes. We have to reinforce all these small changes, and perhaps the youth will hold hands with the older generation like us to ensure that they still have a future lah. Yeah, basically. So there's Lavanya, you and Jayo. Which one?
Jaya, go first, please.
Okay, so I'm responding to what Kyron talked about in terms of intergenerational responsibility, and then I'm going to weave it together with what Nisa has just mentioned in terms of the mental and the anxiety and the challenges in terms of mental health that these challenges present. Kyron's intergenerational responsibility, I want to put that in context of the previous panel that you've just had in terms of the startup ecosystem in particular. I think I'd just like to, assuming that most of the audience have stayed on to this session, I think, to the older generation and the younger generation. So let's say the investors and the mentor types in the ecosystem, there is that intergenerational responsibility as well in terms of guidance as you guide them, as you give them the tools. Because the startup leaders, they are raring to go, and they are blank slates. And so when we hand down these tools and these introducing them into these systems and structures, I think it's really important that we also tell them that take what we are sharing with you with a really curious mind, and you learn as much as you can, but you learn it from a very you got to figure out your own compass, because like Lavanya was talking about, the time scale is really different, and change is just really happening at a rapid speed. So the landscape is already totally different, and someone's mentioned, obviously, what's gotten us here will not get us there. All right, that's for sure. And so I think Adeline in the previous panel talked about unlearning, and that's really important as well, because if you don't unlearn, you're going to have this cognitive dissonance. All right, because if you don't unlearn the old things about business culture, let's talk about, like, say, for example, emissions carbon trading, right? So if you're going to just take Wall Street trading knowledge, because hey, that's the best practice, right? Like winning and like who's the best, and you take that and you bring that into emissions trading schemes and forgetting that it is a solution for a much bigger problem. Now you lose that context. You don't unlearn the hidden scaffoldings and the foundations of trading per se, and you import that unknowingly, and these subconscious cultural notions, which are so fundamental, and the challenge is we have no nomenclature for it, and we don't have the words for it. We are not identifying it as a thing, and we don't know then how to respond to it and deal with it, so that we're not on top of it, and it's on top of us. And then all we have is this: we're going to run into conflicts, we're going to run into resistance, we're going to run into problems with our stakeholders, right? So we might have great relationship with our investors, but then with the stakeholders, say with the state government, for example, or worse, with the communities living in the forests from which you are harvesting these carbon credits, and other communities. So we need to go into this, like, that mind space is really important, where you can really learn new things and rewrite the old things, but using old tools. So that's a challenging game. Thanks.
And if I can jump in on this idea of hope, right? I think great points that both Kyron and Jaya have raised. I just want to say that, part of the inaction maybe from our generation, or lack of action rather, I mean, there's a bit more action now, I guess, at least, if not real action, at least lip service action. But I'm joking, but I think there is now movement towards real action too. Is that we need to take maybe some guidance or some hope, some strength from recent past crisis that we faced. And this is and my late father actually pointed this out when I was talking to him about climate change, climate action, why people are not able to sort of really move with it. And he said, well, back in when we turned you remember in 2000 we had the Y2K problem, when we changed to the millennium, right? And everybody didn't know. There was so much uncertainty in that shift, and people were just wondering whether everything is going to crash. All that we knew is just going to evaporate. But that didn't stop us in the lead up to start taking measures, start taking action, start being prepared. And when 2000 came, we just sailed through. There's no, nothing stopped, nothing, we didn't, society didn't stop existing as we know it, right? We sailed through, but that was because understanding the challenge ahead, we took stock and started doing whatever we can. We started planning, we started working together as, putting all our heads together to try and face the problem and overcome it. So likewise, that is the kind of mindset we need. And there is hope. I mean, it's the young people need to be prepared, but us, the generation that has kind of contributed to where we are today, also need to do our part. I'd just like to do a little plug for a report that WWF and BCG, Boston Consulting Group, WWF Malaysia and Boston Consulting Group have just come out with. It's called Securing Our Future, Net Zero Pathways for Malaysia, which has been launched in Glasgow. And it's a free resource. And there we are sort of seeing what are the potential actions that we can take. So there are 10 priorities. And one of the key priorities is what I think Jaya cautioned about, safeguards, making sure that while we are chasing this, low emissions pathway and, trying to develop with, lowering our carbon emissions or carbon intensity, we must make sure all those actions are not going to cause future problems down the line for the environment or for society. So it has to be a holistic approach. We have to really then again put together all minds. All minds have to come together to chart out these pathways, right? So one important thing, whether it is protecting our forests, having a carbon market, decarbonizing, whatever it is, safeguards are very important. And the second thing that's also emphasized strongly is, apart from mitigation, adaptation is equally important. It's two parts of the same coin. But in the journey, I'll also say before I stop, a lot, even within Malaysia, a lot of innovation that's happening. Some that might even become game changers, not for Malaysia alone, but globally. So there is hope. And when you have a challenge like this, and it's good that the government has also set some kind of 2050 timeline and goal, we have something to focus towards, then our minds can focus and start coming up with the solutions that are needed, right? So there is hope.
Thanks very much, Lavanya, for bringing that up. Indeed, I think although there is this thought that, whatever we had, it's not going to get to where we are. It's not so much to say that the previous generation is to blame, but it's very interesting that every single person on this earth today, alive today, actually has that shared not only responsibility, but actually this adventure moving forward into and recreating this new world that we can have in this so-called Great Reset. And with that, I'd like to move on to another question, because for a lot of people, Malaysia is a very small country. And even if, we achieve the ambition that our government has set for us, which is to cut emissions by 45% across the entire economy, measured against GDP, it's unlikely to actually leave a dent on the global emissions. So I guess a very obvious question that people would struggle with is, why then should we be, dealing with our emissions? And as you mentioned there about adaptation, should we actually be just focusing on adaptation to face off the worst of climate change instead of focusing our effort into mitigation? What are your thoughts there? Maybe we can start with Lavanya and then move on to Karen and then Jaya.
Sure. actually, you cannot take climate action as only mitigation or only adaptation. They're two sides of the same coin. You have to do both. You have to do both, right? So a lot of the time, the focus has unfortunately been on mitigation for the longest time. When you talk about climate change, you'll always talk about emissions reduction or, offsetting and so on. And that now is slowly shifting towards understanding that adaptation is also equally important. Part of it is because the narrative is always pushed by, the stronger northern country interests. And for them, they have not really faced the impacts of climate change until recently. Now, recently, we've heard about forest fires and, flooding and all sorts of other things in rich countries as well, right? So now it's becoming more apparent that adaptation also needs to happen at the same equal pace. So it's not about one or the other. What was your question, Lijin? I think I had a point to raise on something you said.
In relation to, should we be
Malaysia.
concentrate? Yeah, Malaysia is going to leave such a small dent. So
Right.
should we even be doing anything about emissions?
Yeah. So so as I said, it has to be done in tandem. But if we look at Malaysia itself, we have rich nature. We are a mega diverse, rich country. Nature is a strong resource for us. It's a domestic resource, but it's also a global resource. Domestic, it actually provides resilience. So what Khairun mentioned it earlier, nature-based solutions is something that we can embrace strongly, making sure that what we do moving forward harnesses the benefits that nature provides, not destroys it, right? So that we can meet multiple goals. So nature-based solutions are solutions that enable us to meet multiple objectives. For example, climate mitigation, because if you continue to protect your trees, if you reforest, they'll absorb carbon. But also, nature, is part of this amazing, ecosystem that regulates a lot of things. It regulates the water cycle. It helps stabilize soil. So all these things will prevent all kinds of horrific impacts that we have already seen happening, like landslides, flooding regularly, especially in the northern states. We are probably going to face a lot more of this in the coming few months. These kind of things can be moderated if the natural defense mechanisms are in place. I'll give you another example, mangroves. You remember back in 2004, that huge tsunami event, Christmas, Boxing Day, I think, right? And a lot of coastal areas, a lot of lives, a lot of livelihoods were destroyed. But interestingly, those places where there was mangrove protection, the destruction wasn't so huge, right? Because the mangroves were your first line of defense. So thereafter, the country actually decided to start, replanting mangroves around the coastal area, understanding the value. But we don't need to have another tsunami for us to wake up and see what the value of nature is. So as a mega diverse rich country, we can do both, and one of if you'd like, one of the things that we can really use as a magic bullet is to protect nature. So it, gives us multiple benefits. Yeah.
It almost seems that whatever adaptation work that we do, so if we give nature a chance and invest in nature as well, they would be there to take care of us to some point. With that, Khairun, maybe you want to jump in and add some thoughts to that.
Yeah, I wanted to add a bit of a dimension, a local dimension to it and an ethical dimension to it, because I really like what Lavanya said about how our sinks are a resource, our forests are a resource, not just for us, but globally. So there's this conversation that the Malaysian government's talking about how we're going to be using our forests for meeting our own carbon target. And I think I find that really interesting, because while that is, it's our prerogative, it is within our national boundaries, and therefore it is, up to us to decide how to deploy that. But our forests are among some of the most efficient things in the world. And so if we consider ourselves as, a human race, and we're on one planet and we're all sort of on the same ship, what will be the most efficient? Like, it matters where these things are. It matters where you plant. It's not about how it's not about the number of trees you plant, but where you plant and how it's monitored over time. And so what's really interesting is this idea of could we consider our sinks as a global resource? And if it could, then should we only be using it for local use for us to meet our mitigation targets? And if it is, then therefore, would that then keep the Malaysian government or just, us as Malaysians from, will we take that for granted and say that because of our sinks, we don't need to decarbonize any further, we don't need to reduce our mitigation targets any further because we're already rich in this resource? So it's really two parts of it, right? One is it's really that question of opportunity for us to innovate, to say that, we could use climate change as that way of seeing new economies, the creation of new economies, and one of them is definitely that the carbon markets. And if we reforest, could we then not just trade it internationally, but could we generate new ways of creating economies of the forest? So, for instance, agroforestry or beekeeping or things like our, how much can we actually generate from forest protection? So I think that's a really interesting perspective and an ethical one for us to consider as well. But then the second part about adaptation, I think, is the question about, I think about this often, primarily because I think there's a lot of narratives around, creating a new world economy, but I think there's also a need for us to think about that transition story, right? And so, like, for me personally, I think, if we know that we've only got 8 years, that's not a lot of time. And, so many of us who are in this space are thinking, well, maybe for insurance, we should buy a plot of land in the middle of nowhere and consider that, select a transition town somewhere and work on governance systems or governance structures that might actually give us the best chance of survival. So that story about adaptation is a really important one. And one of the projects that PACT is investing in, which is a renewable energy project in Sabah, which is looking to electrify over 200 to 400 villages, rural villages, with microhydro or solar, looks at governance and polycentrism as one of those co-benefits of rural electrification. And what this means is that when communities are able to generate and manage their own electricity use, it also means that they may also be thinking about how to govern it, how to govern food systems, how to govern decision-making, how to govern their education systems. And that creates incredible resilience for communities that help adapt against the worst impacts of climate change. So I think there's that story around opportunity of how we can leapfrog from using centralized systems of governance, but also electricity production and food systems and the way we've always done things, and using that as there's really an opportunity here to innovate.
Yeah, thanks, Karen, for bringing up that point. And I'd like to just say how my namesake actually in the audience, Dijin, actually also did ask the question about whether a hyper-local approach is actually what we live and play for. But it seems to me that we need to build that hyper-local sort of solutions where you say that your communities empowering themselves and things like that, but at the same time keeping in the context of we are a global world, we are a global community as well. And it's not like we're completely distinct from each other. So every effort actually adds to it. Every effort actually counts. And with that, I can see that time is quite short. Jael, if you want to add in there, and I'll pass it back to Nisa.
Okay, I think the question is a very common one, to say that, hey, we're such a small country, it's not going to make a difference. That's a loser's mindset, right? That's not what leaders think, right? And so if we want to thrive in the face of a world that's going to face with climate change, if we want to thrive where sustainability is going to be so mainstream, then that's really not the kind of attitude we really need to get rid of. That kind of attitude. We need to embrace leadership, because constraints are very powerful things. Constraints are the things that make us stronger. So back to the startup ecosystem, startups that are swimming in access to funds, they don't last long. That's what you always see, because they are not forced to be, truly lean and mean and be really agile. So they're going to disintegrate, when a real challenge emerges. So constraints are very powerful because it is these constraints where we're talking about reducing our contribution of emissions. These constraints are going to encourage, and that's going to build our kind of change makers, whether it's in the civil society sector, private sector, public sector. These constraints that we apply to ourselves, because as Karen mentioned, because it is the right thing to do, now that's going to enable us to build that character, which is solutions, that innovative thinking, and finding and championing the solutions that we homegrown over here. So I think that's a really important aspect of it. Of course, the message of justice is that, because what each of us do really matters, because the problem with climate change is it is a problem of organized irresponsibility. When everyone consistently says it's not my problem, it's someone else's problem. And so if we are to hold colonizers to account for what they've done before, remember that even before, British citizens were asking colonizing companies about their impacts on indigenous communities. And so that is why in our federal constitution, you will see that the local adat is being recognized, because the British draftsmen, they were answerable to the folks, in the asking questions of the London Stock Exchange, and asking how these British company, British India, Timor, right, and all these colonizing companies that in the quest of inventorizing the East and making money from that, they were doing it in a way that was palatable to the investors back home. So it's about doing better. Yeah, thank you.
Thanks,
Yeah,
Jaya.
I want to expand from what you said about this losers mindset, right? But there are so many people out there who still don't care. They think like, we're gonna die anyway. We are so pessimist. Yes, we talk about hope, but there are still people, like pockets of people that you see every day that refuse to adapt and mitigate. So how do we address this? What is that message that we want to create, this sense of urgency to let them know, hey, right now with COVID-19, you are forced to wear masks. Do you want to wear masks? Like in June, right? You wear masks, right? Because temperature is like so bad. You cannot live anymore. But people just don't care. You know what? I'm gonna die anyway. So what is the message?
I think self-awareness, and Lisa, I think the mental health is self-awareness is first thing. It's like knowing that I feel too weak, that I can't cope with these things. I can't cope with the increasing complexity and the expectations of me as a leader. Then I think being aware of that, then take a back seat. Don't be on the decision-making table. Take a back seat, let others lead. Then, because we are all at different stages and journeys, right? So like, if you don't feel that you are enough, then be aware that you're not being strong, and that's okay. So take a back seat, don't dominate the agenda, and let others a chance to lead and develop, and co-develop and encourage others, give space. I think that self-awareness is really important. Thank you.
What are your thoughts there? I see Lavanya hands up already.
That was a hand up earlier to respond to something that Khairun said. I will come to that, but yeah, one thing I think that actually makes quite a big difference is, okay, I've talked about science, but I think the arts, the arts makes a huge impact on how we behave. We need to internally hardwire ourselves differently, and the only way to do that effectively and realistically is through the arts. If you see a powerful an image that speaks to you, immediately your actions will be modified and changed. Likewise, if you watch a film that might have some kind of messaging that's creatively done. I mean, advertising works on this all the time, right? If advertising can do it to make us consume more, why can't advertising, that same tool, be used to make us moderate in our consumption, make us aware of what we are consuming and why we are consuming it, and what we are associating that consumption with, right? Because that is one of the root causes of the problem, that we sort of have our self-identity attached to what we consume and how we consume. And that's kind of messaged, so hardwired in through the messaging that we get all over, right? From, the country is successful if our GDP is growing so much, to, you're successful if you have the Dunhill watch or whatever it is, right? Or driving the, latest Mercedes or BMW. So I'm just saying that the tool is probably there. It's there, using the arts. And I mean, we have seen, incentives and, disincentives also as part of the toolbox. But really, when you go straight to the heart rather than, through the head, rather than you reacting to an incentive or disincentive, but really doing it because you feel this is what you want to do, it's aligned with who you are, then I think we can start seeing action. So this is what I think we need to work with the advertisers as well and say, look, you guys need to do your part. Now, if I can just have 2 minutes, I just want to flip back to what Khairun was saying about the carbon markets, right? And forest trading. Khairun, I just want to provide a little bit of a different dimension on international carbon trading and forest trading, and what Malaysia's position on it is, and why I feel that, yes, our forest carbon should be kept for Malaysian needs. I understand where you're coming from, but the bigger fear is if, this kind of forest trading occurs, the big polluters out there will continue to pollute and then offset rather than take the immediate action they need to take right now. As I mentioned, the carbon budget is limited. Those people can't continue to, create more emissions and then offset it through, buying forest carbon credits from countries like ours. That won't work. That won't work for the globe as well, right? So that's why I think, keeping the forest carbon for Malaysia to account for the emissions of Malaysia makes sense. But I think the government has also come up with, under the REDD+ financing framework, another instrument called the forest conservation offsets, I think, or forest conservation credits, sorry. And that international companies can buy into to keep protecting, the forests for all the other services they provide as well, which they benefit from a supply chain perspective, right? And that instrument will also, serve towards keeping forests intact and, for forests to continue serving that global carbon sequestration service. Just one more point on the point of why Malaysia needs to take mitigation action. We are a trading nation, right? We are a completely, trade embedded nations. Most of our, GDP, if you take a look at it from the GDP perspective, is from our trading with all different countries. Now, our trading partners are going to take stronger and stronger action. Trading partners are already asking for sustainably produced goods. We've seen that with oil palm, and it's going to just keep, going in that direction, especially in terms of demands for low carbon produced goods. And, in Europe, they're already coming up with this border carbon adjustment framework, where they're going to tax goods coming into Europe for some goods, where which then make it, which then would make carbon intensive goods that, from Malaysia, for example, more expensive. So it's a matter of being competitive as well, that we need to embrace that that journey together, regardless of the size of our country or emissions.
Great. Let me just respond to that really quickly before we wind up. Sorry, everyone. But essentially, I think I respectfully disagree, Lavanya, because as much as, you say that it would, it's going to be used as a greenwashing tool for international organizations. Malaysia is going to be the same. So we'd have our big companies who are announcing net zero, like Petronas, buying up our forest carbon. So it's essentially the same thing. And I think if I understand it correctly, the REDD+ units only carbon benefits can be traded locally, domestically, but non-carbon benefits can be traded internationally. So it's a slight distinction there when it comes to the price of carbon. And I think if we're able to demonstrate that the value of carbon is higher and as demand internationally, the value will go up, which means that it becomes a new asset class and a commodity that will mean that more and more landowners would want to be converting available land or to forests, but also keeping our remaining forests intact. So just a quick narrative on that, but also to add on what Lavanya said earlier about nudging, right, and advertising and how we can actually encourage people through policy to make the right decisions. But I think broadly we should recognize it as well that people have rights, and therefore if you consider what's happening in Europe where the rates of vaccination is at 60-70% because people say I have rights not to take the vaccine, we'll see a lot of that to say I have the right to drive my car or my petrol diesel car, etc. And I think it's something that we absolutely need to engage. And this is why I think there's a question about governance and policy and whether or not that needs to evolve as well. And we need to regulate decisions a lot more strongly. So yeah, I think there's been some great conversation around that, and we'd love to continue to chat.
Thank you very much, Karen, Jael, and Lavanya for your thoughts on that. And I guess just before I pass it to Nisa to close on this session, I'd like to add in that what Lavanya and Karen just really threw out there near the end about these supply chains and how, consumers actually are demanding changes and all that. I really encourage all of you to also look out what's happening in the circular economy realm, because it is directing the attention to deal with all the emissions as well as material needs that's in our day-to-day products. It's not just about renewable energy that will bring us there. It's not just about offsets that will bring us there, but we have a whole suite of tools in our toolbox that society should really be tapping into. And I'd like to encourage all of you to, as in the last panel, explore, experiment, find your own passion, find what fire is already in your heart, and you will be able to bring that to the sustainability agenda, because it's all of our lives. So with that, I'll pass it back to Nisa for the closing. Thanks.
Yes, thank you very much, Lee Jin and the rest of panelists. You can keep the question coming if we have time. I know we don't. So to summarize our discussion today, we have to claim our rights to our future, to make the change now, to have the agency, to the will to change before things get too late, and the structures are enforced onto us. So don't wait until all of us have to wear masks because the air is too contaminated to breathe in, and the suit maybe because the temperature is too high and dangerous. And also influence the people around you to take action. We have to lead the fire. We have to talk to someone about this, make some noise in your organization, force your, superior to make a change, make an event or something, just make a noise, keep making noise. So we hope that everyone truly enjoyed our discussion today. So thank you to all of our panelists for your insights, which have added valuable perspectives into our topic. And in the end, that's what this panel is all about. Do we participate in a discussion of cynicism, or do we participate in a discussion of hope? Until we meet again, I'm Nisa and my coordinator. Thank you very much. If you have questions, just keep it coming. We'll get our panelists to answer in the future. Thank you.
Thank you very much, everyone.
Thanks, everyone. Take care. Bye.
Bye. Stay
Thanks
safe.
all. Bye.
Bye.